we're all really excited to hear what you have to say. Some of the people in the chat field have already been saying
I know.
that lower levels is quite scary, you know, I really hate teaching lower levels. And then there seems to be some confusion as to lower levels meaning lower age groups. So I'm going to leave you with all this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Chip. Thank you. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon then. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I know a teacher's time is so precious and so short. So thank you for spending a bit of time here. And I'm sorry we're starting a little bit later than planned. So Chia has already introduced the subject and has asked you a little bit about defining lower levels. And I'll just show you here what we'll go through within the webinar. So, and we'll still hopefully have time to finish off all of it. So in this webinar, we're going to define lower levels, which Chia has already started with you, which is fantastic. I was reading your answers whilst waiting to start. We're going to reflect on our experience as a second language lower level learner, because I'm sure we've all been there. We'll consider linguistic theory relevant to lower levels. We'll share our views about teaching lower levels. I think some of you have already said you're scared and everything, but don't be, it's fine. And we'll then go on to look at some tips and techniques for teaching lower levels, and we'll look at some classroom activities that you can immediately use in the classroom. So let's look first of all, defining lower levels, our first point. So I see some of you have already answered in here saying what you believe a lower level to be. What terms keep coming up here? I see we've had false and we've had absolute, zero, all the ones that were on the screen, which is great. So for the sake of ease, I'll say that a false beginner here is someone with basic knowledge of English. So maybe this is an adult who learned English decades ago when they were at school. So they might make more rapid progress than the absolute beginner. The absolute beginner, also known as the zero beginner or the true beginner, they've had zero exposure to English. So maybe they're from a developing country, maybe the context there is English for speakers of other language, there may be a lack of literacy even. So for that type of beginner, no course books, no handouts, you're just going to be using speaking and listening skills in that class. Now, I've got starter here as another term, and this is the term that I absolutely love. It's my favorite term. It's a catch-all for whatever your circumstance. So it could be, English could be the third, fourth, fifth language that you're learning. You could be any age. You could be in your home country. You could be in another country. Wherever you are, it's your start of the journey on the language trip. So for me, start is a fantastic term. And Chia's already mentioned about how we define lower levels. And for the sake of this webinar, we're going to define it as pre-A1, A1 to A2, and any age group within that. So let me show you. I think you're all no doubt aware of the CAF Framework and those descriptors for different levels. So here we've got the descriptors for A2 and A1, which I hope you'll be able to read there. I've underlined key bits of information. I'll just read those out to you now. So we've got frequently used expressions, immediate relevance, simple and direct, immediate environment, and immediate need. At A1, the key language, familiar everyday expressions, very basic, can interact in a simple way. So we can see immediately that that's about relevance, immediacy, simplicity, familiarity, basic. If I ask you to look at the very last sentence of the A1 box, and I'll read that out, it's someone who can interact in a simple way, provided the other person talks slowly and clearly and is prepared to help. And that, of course, is where you come in as a teacher, that we're the ones who have to speak clearly, speak slowly, and be prepared to listen and to help our students. So we've got a bit of a definition of what lower levels are. I'd like now to move on to the second point and think about just for a couple of seconds, reflecting on our experience when we were learning a second language for the first time. So maybe that first lesson, a first course you went on, if I could ask you to have a think about that, and in the chat box, which you're all using beautifully, could I ask you to enter a number? So if your experience was poor, it's going to be a 1. If your experience was very positive, it's going to be a 5. I'll give you a few seconds to have a think and tap in a number. Oh, there's lots of different numbers. Interesting. Wow. Did I see an 8 then? That must have been an incredibly incredible experience. And a 7. Oh. 2, 6. Oh, amazing. Loads. Great. Okay. Lovely. I'll very briefly tell you mine. In fact, I should enter my number. I've just entered a number 1 because that's how bad mine was when I had my first experience. So for me, the very first experience I had of learning a second language was French. And I was 12 or 13. We'd moved from one part of the country to another part. Slightly different education system there. So where I was previously, I'd had a year of German. Where I was moving to, they'd done 2 years of French, no German. And I was put into the class, the French class, that had been doing French for 2 years. So I'm sure we all know that that was not the right class for me. But anyway, I was in there. And the teacher only spoke French, which is fantastic, if you understood it. And she absolutely embraced me as part of the class and just asked me all the same questions that she did everyone else. Which was awful because I didn't even have the language to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand. So she carried on asking me questions and I carried on saying, I don't know in English until I was sent out of the room. And so I went to the headmaster's office and said that I'd been sent out of the room and asked if I could just work in the library instead, because it was near the end of term and there was summer holidays. I wouldn't have to do French anymore. So it was a very negative first experience for me. But then after the summer holidays, we went back and German started, and I had a fantastic German teacher. So I've got to very quickly type in 5 here for an excellent teacher who coped really well with the fact that I was a year ahead. She'd ask me the odd question to keep me going or give me an extra bit of written exercises to do. It was a very natural way of allowing me to carry on learning and not disrupting the class. So a bit of a mix for me, to be honest. And oh, your answers are still coming in, and they're really interesting and really varied. Okay, let's move on to having a quick think about linguistic theory relevant to lower levels. Now, obviously, this isn't a webinar on language learning theories. That would be a whole other webinar series, of course. But there's a couple of things that I'd just like to pick up on for lower levels that I think are really important. And really, and certainly when I was thinking back about my experience of learning a second language, I thought, oh, yes, that's definitely applied to my situation. So the first one we're going to look at, Krashen's input hypotheses from 1982. This is also known as the monitor model, so you might have heard it as that name. So we've got those 5 points there. So acquisition, learning. So acquisition being that subconscious acceptance of language that we have with our L1 usually. And learning, which is that formal and conscious choice to receive language when you sign up to go to an Italian evening course, for example. Second point is natural order, that there's a sequence of language, that we're going to go from easier to more difficult. So, for example, in a lower level class, pre-A1, A1, A2, you're not going to introduce the third conditional. Not appropriate there. Third point, monitor. And this is like a sort of internal self-corrector. So when the language is being thought about and uttered, the monitor monitors it for errors and any deviation of speech. So a really good learner will use this technique quite naturally. Point 4, comprehensible input. So very simply, that's exactly what it says. It's making sure that whatever it is being said, written, is comprehensible. It's not above level, it's not below level, it's at the right level. And ideally you want it to be stretching a little bit beyond the level we're at, but it must be comprehensible. So, for example, I mentioned the French class that I had as a teenager. That was not comprehensible to me. Last one, number 5, this is one of my favourites, the affective filter hypothesis. So this is all about the emotional variables, the anxiety, the desire to succeed, all how the emotion affects us in our learning, and how the environment of learning should always be positive and welcoming and encouraging. And hopefully most of the time it is, but sometimes not. Let's move on to a study that I will quickly mention here. This is really interesting because it's directly contrasting the lower levels to B1 and B2. It's only out last October, actually. And this is very interesting as regards the affective filter hypotheses, the emotional variables that I just spoke about. This is a study with 407 native Spanish students at levels A1, A2, B1 and B2. And they completed a questionnaire to explain what they attributed their perceived success and failure in learning a language was. And I think this is really, really interesting. So the B2 students attributed their failure to external factors, to the teacher, to the difficulty of the task, not their fault. The A1 students, in contrast, attributed their failure as an internal factor, as their personal responsibility. It was all about their own effort and their commitment. So it's something to be really aware of with lower levels, just that, I suppose, emotional vulnerability, the emotional needs and how much support they need. Let's move on here to just 2 more tiny theories to touch upon. As I say, there's so many and all of them fantastic, but these are ones that I think are particularly relevant. So the contrastive analysis hypothesis, which suggests that errors made in the L2 experience from the L1. So if we've got an L1 and an L2 that are linguistically similar or close on that language tree, so say Italian and Spanish, there'll be a positive transfer and fewer errors. So you might get a lower level learner who's Spanish and wants an Italian doing brilliantly and just flying through it and seeming to progress incredibly well. In contrast, if an L1 and an L2 are less similar, there's more distance on that language tree, it's going to have a negative transfer, there's going to be a greater number of errors, and it will be harder to learn. So, for example, Chinese and English. So there's evidence for and against this, but it's something to be aware of, that if you have a multilingual class or different writing systems, it is something to bear in mind. The second theory to briefly mention is the cognitive load theory. And this is super relevant, I think, to lower levels, because I think we all remember when you're first starting to learn something and you can almost feel that mental load in your head of trying to contain all that new information because there's just so much to take in. And it is difficult, definitely, I think. And so the cognitive load theory says that this is about Miller's information processing research, that shows that your short-term memory or your working memory is limited in what it can hold. So we need to reduce that cognitive load by making the task achievable. Achievable is a word we will come back to later. Reduce that cognitive load, make it achievable, and then that information can move from that working memory into the long-term memory. So we've got successful learning taking place. And so important for lower levels, because sometimes you can whiz through a course book very, very quickly, but actually, have you got down there and actually got into the language and learned it well? Let's move on. Here we are. So she has already asked you this question about sharing your views about teaching lower levels, and we had a scared as one answer and some positives. So could I ask you now, how do you feel about teaching lower levels? So just like with cheer, maybe type in one adjective, type in a sentence, whatever you fancy. Positive, challenging, inspired, quite happy, love it. Oh, I love it too. Adore them, me too. Fantastic, me too. Unpredictable, exhausting, yeah. Oh, these are great, wow. Oh, thank you so much for your answers. These are brilliant. A bit slow, challenging. It can be hard, absorbing. Yeah, lovely. Motivating, creative, sweet, confident, frustrating, demanding. I love it, but tiring. Yes, that's a super answer. Stretching, great. Enchanted. Oh, beautiful. Lovely. Okay. I'll tell you very briefly, if I may, about how I feel about teaching lower levels. They're my favourite level. I absolutely love them. So anyone that's saying something positive, I'm with you. They're the best level to teach. I think it's great teaching a C1 class. You get into the nitty-gritty of language. It's fascinating. It's great teaching B1 and B2, sorting out errors, going towards an exam. Great. But lower levels are the best. I think you get such a speed of progress with them. You see that struggle from nothing, from perhaps a literal zero beginner, up to getting that first sentence, to having a tiny dialogue with each other, to then remembering a word that you introduced a week ago. It's fantastic. And you also get, I think because of that, because it is hard, it's hard for them and for us, for sure. Everyone's mentioned, quite a few people have mentioned how tiring it is for teachers. But I love that. I think there's more of a rapport and a bond with lower levels. I think that's much stronger at lower level. They know how much you want them to succeed and how much you're cheering them on. And we know how huge their efforts are and how difficult it is. I remember when I had my first lower level class to teach, there were 2 students, one South Korean and one Turkish. So we didn't have the option of L1, either me with them or with each other. We didn't have particularly great materials in the staff room, and that's not because it wasn't a well-equipped library. I think the lowest level were maybe elementary, and these 2 students were absolute beginners. So that was very challenging. And I had a fantastic director of studies who encouraged me to just mix and match between course books, create my own materials. They told me about making sure I had a change of pace, and they warned me, you are going to be exhausted. There's a lot of emphasis on the teacher work in there, and the students will be exhausted. Cognitive load we've just spoken about. It's quite a tough challenge. So yeah, I'm just still reading your comments. Challenging but fulfilling, challenging but inspiring. Yes, so a mix. There's quite a lot of positive though. That's good. That's good. And I hope by the end of this webinar, I'll have shown you a few tips and techniques and a few things you can do, and hopefully you'll all love them then. So let's go on now, without further ado, to having a look at tips and techniques to use with lower levels. And I've mentioned to you earlier that the word I really like for lower levels is starter, because it's starting that journey. And also, I recently wrote Speak Your Mind starter level. So starter is very much in my head as a good word and appropriate here. And so I'd like to use this word, starter, as an acronym, STARTER, for the tips and techniques that you can use with lower levels. I just have to mention quickly, I just read one comment saying you cannot wing it at lower levels from Julie. That's very true. I think teachers who teach lower levels, they're probably better teachers. Is that okay to say? I think so. It's true. They're teachers who have worked hard to prepare, and they're really, it's easy to pick up a B1 class in half an hour and go in there and teach a skills lesson. It's not easy to do that with an A1 class. No? So let's start with S, our first letter of the word starter for syllabus, which is a very, 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 very big word, isn't it? So I don't mean syllabus in the sense of this is your first year, the whole syllabus for your class. I mean what you're going to teach, when you're going to teach it. So think back to Krashen and that the order or sequence, the natural order of language. And if you look in most course books, there is a very similar sequence of grammatical structures. We're going to start with to be, and further along in a few units, might come in. So what you're going to teach, when you're going to teach it, how you're going to teach it, which course book is best for your needs. How will you present language? Will you use newspapers? Will you go to a cafe and order drinks there? How will you provide a sufficient change of pace? We've said about how tiring it can be for students and teachers. what you're going to teach, when you're going to teach, how you're going to teach it, and most importantly, why you are teaching it, your aims. So your aims of the lesson, you need to think how do each of these activities and each of these stages within the lesson contribute to the aim of the lesson. And I think you should be super, super, super strict with your aims. If there isn't an identifiable aim to an activity, if you can't justify why that is in your lesson plan, then you need to get rid of it. It shouldn't be in there. All your minutes in your lower level class are valuable. So make sure that if there's something in your syllabus, in your lesson plan, it's valuable. Please, please make sure of that. And plan your lesson. I'm sure because you're all here, frankly, and you're here interested in development, that you are good, conscientious lesson planners. And that's key. Plan, plan, plan your lesson. Let's move on to the next letter. Here we go. So letter T, 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 which of course stands for T, T, T. Anyone in the chat box? Training, teaching, here we go. Teacher talk time. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Yes, good. Teacher talk time. So we all know, I think most of us follow the communicative approach. So our aim is always to reduce our teacher talk time and increase the students' talking time. And it is by producing language and activating it that students are practicing and progressing, which is exactly what we want. So we need them speaking. And even if we acknowledge, yes, lower levels have a smaller lexicon, and yes, they have less working knowledge of the language, we should still keep their aim of increasing their talking time, decreasing ours, find opportunities for them to speak. And I'm not saying, that doesn't mean I'm saying, don't say anything as a teacher, do the silent method. You can if you want, that's a different webinar. But I'm saying just remember that all of your oral output, not just given instructions or setting activities, it's the greetings you choose when they walk in the classroom. It's how you say, well done, correct, good. Or it's how you correct them. It's how you say bye at the end of the class. All of your output matters. So if you have a B1 class, a B2 class, you probably don't need to self-monitor or regulate your language just as much, but you do with lower levels. So when you do give an instruction, make it clear, make it comprehensible. And if you want, I'd actually suggest literally planning your script, writing down some ideas for how you will set an activity up, how you will explain an instruction. I think this really, really helps you stop, think, reflect, and really develop as a teacher. That self-awareness is absolutely critical. So if I may, I'd like to ask you a question now about your teacher output in giving instructions. And the question is, how do you put lower level students into pairs or groups for an activity? So have a think and maybe jot your ideas into the chat box. Pictures and gestures, yep. Concept check questions, gestures. Intergroup. Yeah, lovely. There's an actual use the hands and show them. Stronger students with weaker ones, absolutely. Groups of two, first letter name, stronger, weaker ones. Lovely ideas. Lovely. Okay, so if I can just, sorry, I'm still busy. Yeah, thank you very much for the answers. They're brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking part in that. That's great. So I think you can almost give an instruction to put students into pairs with 2 letters and 1 word. So for example, A, B, pair. A, B, pair. A, B, pair. You can say very, very little and get them into the correct formation you want for classroom management. And the same with groups. If you want to put them into groups, and a few people have asked about levels and getting people into groups. So you could mix and match here and say student A, student B, student C, student D, 1 group. And mix and match them and put them together. Let's go on to another question. Whilst we're thinking about instructions, the big elephant in the room is, of course, L1. Do you use it or not? So if I could ask you to have a think about this, what are the positives of using L1 with a lower level class? I'll also ask you about what are the negatives in a minute, but let's look at the positives first of all, if that's okay. Yeah, time saving. Absolutely, that's true. Gives confidence. Less worrying, reduces stress. Oh, these are lovely answers. Quicker, yep. Yeah, fantastic. Avoid misunderstanding. Get confidence. Useful for large groups. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again. Brilliant, brilliant answers. Brilliant answers. Yeah, exactly. I think that the truth is there are positives to using L1. Again, use L1 or not to use L1. It's another webinar. It's such a huge topic and so contentious. But yeah, there's huge positives. If your knowledge of their L1 is good, fine. It's for relief, isn't it? Sometimes to give them that break, that work of thinking about that cognitive load, thinking about making that information processing smoother and easier. It's a bit of relief. It's definitely for confidence sometimes, and like the effective filter hypothesis, it's good to have that positive environment. It's safe, isn't it? And it's secure. And what else? We've got ritual and to cooperate. We've had for classroom management to put it into groups. Yes, lovely. So let's move and flick the question now and say, what are the negatives of using L1 with a lower level class? So we've looked at the positives. What are the bad things? Dependence. Oh, absolutely. Bad habit. Yeah, they fall back on the L1. Absolutely. Slow again. Yeah. Slow again in the language. They'll continue to translate. Yes. Reliance on it. Great answers here. Yes, less effort. Yes, I think that's true as well. Less effort. Prevents immersion. Yes, it's not challenging. Yes, interesting. Okay. So there's, just as there are positives, there are absolute negatives. I think sometimes it's not even an option anyway. If you have a multilingual class, if you have 5-6 languages, unless you're a polyglot, I'm sure some of you are, unless you can speak all those languages, it's not going to work. It can result in too much talking in L1, yes, over-reliance on L1, students making less effort, a lot less exposure to the second language, and in most cases, people are paying to come there and learn that second language. It's not representative of the second language environment either, because when you go to another country, sometimes people will speak your language, but sometimes they won't. And yet, it's effort, yes. It's hard. Yep, there's lots of negatives. My personal opinion for using L1 is not to. I think absolutely there are positive reasons, if we've said, but I'd encourage you not to. And I'd encourage you to try to make that first language usage the norm. But there may be situations where there's a judgment call and you want to give a word, a translation or something like that. But try to go for L1. I think even with lower levels, there are ways as we continue, we can see to do that within English. So we've gone syllabus and we've got teacher talk time. We've got A next on our acronym, STA, and A is for achievable. So for achievable, this simply means, let me just pop back to that slide. There we are, super. This relates actually back to S for syllabus, the importance of planning your lesson. It relates to Krashen's comprehensible input to make sure your aim of the lesson, that all-important aim, is achievable. It's cognitive load theory. It's keeping that load at a suitable and achievable level. For example, we're not going to present the present simple structure and regular verbs and irregular verbs and maybe the sounds of the verb endings and expect students to demonstrate a working knowledge of this grammar point by the end of the lesson. It's not going to happen. Be realistic. Challenge your students. Yes, absolutely, absolutely, but don't make it impossible. So when we think we've got an activity that is achievable and it's in class and it's in progress, sometimes it might not be achievable. And one of the ways you need to check the achievability is by monitoring. So this is your, which I'm a huge fan of, this is your opportunity to get feedback on how the class and the individual students are coping. And if you've got a large class, it's an opportunity to get just a tiny bit of one-to-one time with your students. It's so valuable. If you've got a large class, that you could maybe concentrate, this lesson you're going to concentrate on these 5 pairs over here, the next lesson the other 5 pairs. There's ways of dividing up so you can try to get around as many people as you possibly can. And then, of course, think about what you're going to do with the incorrect language you've observed. How will you correct it? Will you keep a list and do it later as a class activity? Will you correct it on the spot? Will you write the error and give it to them for homework to correct for themselves? Many different ways to do that. So try to make things achievable. Use monitoring to check if it is achievable, and then think about how to correct it. And let me ask you a couple of questions again, if I may, to test achievability and your thoughts about it. So my question is, how many lexical items should you teach to lower levels in one lesson? 5 to 7, 1 to 2, 5 to 8, 4, 8 to 10, 6 to 7. Ah, that's interesting. So no one's above 10 at the moment, I don't think. 10 maximum, half a dozen. Depends. There's a 12. 6 maximum. Depends on the age. That's true, isn't it? Yes. 7 to 10, up to 13. 8 is recorded. Depends, 7 to 8. 10, lovely. Lovely, super, thank you. Great, thank you. So I think actually there's quite a lot of consensus there. There's quite a lot of agreement, and research certainly suggests that students are able to learn, digest, and hold in their memory 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 new lexical items per lesson, which doesn't really sound like very much, does it? But it is, because particularly at this level, don't forget that just that one new word is a new orthographic pattern, new phonemes, new graphemes, new word syllable stress, a new form, a new usage, new frequency. There's a lot going on in just that one word. So 6 to 8, 8 to 10, that's definitely the figure that I always have in mind for teaching, and it's always the figure I have in mind when writing materials, to not go above that, or maybe sometimes go above that. We've had a few answers that were above 10. So can I ask you, related to that, which lexical sets are naturally large and comparatively easy to understand? And by lexical sets, I mean a group of language on a similar topic. I won't give you an example because that might give away an answer. So content words, job titles, food, rooms, numbers, sports, animals, yeah, loads. Fantastic hobbies, some word building, office materials, numbers. Wow, loads of great answers. Thank you for this. This is brilliant. Animals, concrete, family. Anything visual, absolutely. Abstract, sports. Yeah, there's lots. Yeah, when we think about it, there are an awful lot that we can push beyond that 10 limit. I'll show you one example of one, if I may. So here we've got an example, and this is from starter level, the book I just mentioned to you a moment ago, and this is on the subject which a number of you have mentioned, which is food. So I think within this exercise we've got 12 items here, so just over the 10. And that's because obviously with food you've got those added complexity issues. We've got the issue of countability. As you can probably guess, that's the grammar point that follows this exercise. It's natural to have a lot of these words together. Conceptually, they're very easy. Visually, they're very easy. There are a few comments saying that the visual groups, you could have a higher number with? Absolutely true. So no abstract meanings here, usually a direct translation, nice and easy. You can definitely go above the number then. So let's go back to our acronyms. We've done S for syllabus, T for teacher talking time, A for achievable, which means we're on to R, which is for repetition. So can I quickly ask you, is repetition important for lower levels? I'm hoping no one's going to say no here. Yes, 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 good, yes, absolutely. It's so important. It's super important. It's essential. Yes, yes, good. Everyone's in agreement. Absolutely. It's so important. It leads to that consolidation of knowledge. It's hand in hand with your syllabus to make sure you're planning a good lesson that flows well, that delivers what's needed, that has a change of pace. It's so important. And it leads to moving that new input through the working memory into the long-term memory. And then when it's there, you can build that neural network and we can lead to further progress in learning. And repetition doesn't mean do exercise B once and then do exercise B again and then do it again. You can change it so much. So you can change it through classroom management, have a class mingle, swap pairs, A, B, change groups, 1, 2, 3, 4, move everyone around, go and speak to a new teacher, go and speak to students in another class, go to a cafe and order a drink. Do the same activity, but do it in a different location or do it in a different way through classroom management. And you can also do it through your practice activities within class. So maybe you want to do a speaking activity based on a grammar point, some written work on that grammar point, just so students have some heads down time as well as some heads up time. There's just a bit of a breather and a bit of a pace, but they're still repeating that language. You can use role plays, board races, flashcards, realia, props, all different ways to keep repeating. So we've done syllabus, teacher talk time, achievable, repetition. We're now on to another T, and we have TPR. And TPR stands for? Any guesses? Vanessa was straight in. There was the first one, I believe. Thank you very much. Total physical response. So then that's based on the theory that physical movement aids your learning of the language. It's certainly a popular technique with younger classes and with teens. I'm sure we've all done that with teenagers and with young classes. It can be miming in its purest sense. Again, thinking of children. So an elephant with the long nose and the big ears, anything that makes it big and memorable. I think it's absolutely appropriate for some adult classes as well. We can say that total physical response can apply to any exaggerated physical movement, any miming, any gesturing. Earlier on, we had quite a few comments in the chat box saying about gesturing and about miming. It's so important and it's so useful because it's a second way of communicating your message. So what could you do with that? You can teach an adjective for it. So we can do to mime that you're very tired. You can write tired on the board. You can give class instructions through TPR. You can open your books, listen, write, read. There's so much you can do with it. I think it's a really useful tool to have with lower levels. And I don't know if on your CELTA courses or your teaching courses, if you had a second language lesson to help you experience what it's like to be a second language learner. We had an example of Swedish language and it was brilliant. So a teacher just stood there, gave us the name for pen and book, drilled, kept going. Can you give us a book? Can you give him a book? And just moving it around. And it was, you had to watch because it was a very physical lesson. So it's a great technique to use. Let me move on to the next letter in starter, and that is empathy. E for empathy. So you can, and obviously this could, another word you could use for this, rapport, emotional intelligence, kindness, listening, patience, soft skills, whatever you want to say. It's that sentiment of respecting the learner as a human being, as someone who is new to a subject, wants to learn the subject, and you're there to help them achieve that goal and that potential. It's not patronizing them. It's not belittling them. It's not talking to them like they're infants. It's not talking to them like they're stupid. So this point, empathy, relates back to the effective filter hypothesis. You know, it's that putting yourself in the student's shoes and thinking, how can I make this a really positive environment? And I think that's a very, very important thing. And I actually think it's a prerequisite for any teacher. You have to have empathy. You have to care. And the fact that you're all here suggests that that's happening already, which is great. And let's move on to the final letter then of our starter acronym. So that begins with an R. Any guesses for the final R, what that could be? Review. Oh, good. Nearly, Amir. Ah, someone's guessed it. Oh, you're too good. Review. Yeah, teacher must love English, absolutely. Fantastic guesses. Someone very clever, I didn't catch your name, I'm so sorry. Someone said repetition. And yes, it's there twice because it's repetition and because it's that important. It's our whole body repetition. It's important. They will benefit from the repetition. There's no more to say. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So for the starter acronym, for the tips and techniques I'd like you to try to remember to use, or just to think about your syllabus, think about your aims of the lesson, what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, what are your aims. Teacher talk time, think about your output, what you're saying, how you're going to give instructions. Achievable, make sure that the task you're setting is achievable, that you've planned it well in your syllabus, and that when you monitor, you can check and see how achievable it is. Repetition, I don't need to explain that. Keep repeating, it's important. TPR, total physical response, use mime, use gesture, use these other techniques to help you express classroom management, express meanings of things. Empathy, you've got to have that for sure. And repetition again, because it's so important. So let us move on again. Excuse me. So this is the final part where we're going to look at some classroom activities. I'm hoping that we'll have time to look through each of the 4 language skills and each of the 4 language systems. So to look at lexis, grammar, phonology and function. And each of these 8 are so interlinked. I'd really like to look at all of them together, because obviously if your pronunciation is good, if you're working on your phonology, that's going to help you speaking. If you know a lot of grammatical structures, that's going to help you with your reading. They all interlink. So it's important in your syllabus, when you're thinking of your lesson, to plan and include a cross-section of all of these and to keep a balance. So I'm going to show you some examples from the Speak Your Mind starter level student book, but these are also approaches and techniques that you can use with whatever materials that you're using. So we're going to start with reading. Here's the first one. So here we are. Now, the first thing I have to say about this is that when I think of reading, my default expectation is that I'm looking for a chunk of words, a big block of text, like 150, 200 words. That's not true. This is reading here. In its broadest sense, it's the process, it's the process of accessing meaning through that orthography. It could be as simple as recognizing the exit sign and following it. It's reading. It doesn't matter that it's just one word. It's a legitimate example of the reading process. And these 4 cards we've got here are examples of realia. So you could nip into the staff room and borrow somebody's ID card, travel card, business card, library card, gym card, whatever, to demonstrate to students that they can successfully interact with that second language in the real world. It's so important. So this is a lovely, simple reading activity, exactly the same processes. So if we were in a normal seminar group, a sort of workshop environment, I'd ask to put you all into groups and ask you then to go and build the rest of the lesson and decide how you would practice these cards, what language skills you would pull out, what thinking skills you would pull out. But we're not in that context, I'm afraid. And it might be a bit too much for the chat box. And I'm aware that we're running a little bit late as regard the seminar time. So in this instance, I'm going to instead show you what follows in the course book. So I hope you can read this. So activity B, that's locating information in a text. Students are asked to read the cards in A again, circle the names of countries, underline the nationalities and languages. And I think this is the reason I've included this, is because we need to remember that we can still have really solid, excellent, useful reading skills, even at this level. Locating information in a text is an IELTS level skill. It's an exam skill, but we can do it here. You can do all of it with lower levels, you really can. For activity C, if we have a look, we've got 3 sentences there. Just complete the sentences with countries, nationalities, or languages. And this is an example of where you can grade, maybe deal with mixed level classes a little bit. Earlier, someone asked about having a beginner and an elementary, how to cope with that. So for activity C, for that lower level student, they're going to go back to the reading and look at those business cards, find the answer there, and copy the word into the gap. For a higher level student, within the lower level parameters, so a good A1 going on to A2, they can access the information for those gaps from the sentence. We know that Mike's American, so Mike is from the US. And then the last activity there, we've got activity D, thinking skill, to analyze. What does first language mean? What is your first language? So again, just like the reading skill, it's just a reminder that you absolutely can do cognitive skill work, thinking skill work at this level. You've just got to grade the task so that that process can begin. Right. Let me move on to, that's the end of our first skill. The next language skill we're looking at is listening. Now, you will probably notice that there isn't any listening within this slide, and that is because I think the majority of listenings, when we're looking at a course book, they tend to begin with listen and answer a gist question. So you've got something on the location, the setting, the relationship between the speakers. But for lower levels in particular, I'd ask you to go a step back, and before listening, try and have a pre-listening and a bit of activating that schemata, activating students' prior existing knowledge of the world. So here, if we look at the slide, we've got 2 pictures, and the instruction is look at the pictures. Which people are in a store? And fantastic, you're all answering already anyway. So B, and that's because you don't need any language at all to do that, do you? It's just, I know that a store, there's going to be some clothes hanging up, there's going to be a window to the store, there's all the things that we know are in a store, in contrast to A, which is presumably a domestic setting. So whenever you can, for lower levels, do some pre-skill work. Get students thinking about it before they have the listening exercise. Chia's next webinar is all about images, so hang around for that for sure. So in this instance, we've asked students to have a think about which people are in a store. And then, let me move to the next slide, and then we have the audio. Now it plays, and now we match the picture to the question. There we are. So we've got that move from a pre-listening to a gist or a macro understanding of the listening text. And then activity C takes us a little bit deeper again, and we're into looking at detail there. And a nice follow-up to this, I think, is always, I think some people frown upon using the audio scripting class, but I think at times it is useful. It helps build confidence, it reduces stress. It's about achievability with some lower level classes within the lower levels, pre-A1, A1, you might have to use the audio script. What you can do, let's say you've gone through activity A, B, and C of this listening, and then you can listen again with the audio script. Students can check their answers, they can passively assimilate the sounds and the spelling, they have got passive exposure to the intonation and the stress patterns. It's great. Let me move you on to our next language skill, which is speaking. And this is another example from Speak Your Mind. And this is a super simple example of a speaking activity. I think the key thing to remember with teaching speaking with your lower levels is to make sure that you prepared them well for that speaking activity. So at the point that this activity appears in a lesson, before then you will have clearly presented the language that students need to use in the activity. They'll know how to say it, the pronunciation or the intonation. They'll know when to say it in terms of turn taking, not interrupting, listening to your partner. And all of that controlled practice is really important. It leads to greater competence, greater confidence, and it facilitates that freer and more spontaneous practice, which will come later. So this speaking activity, as I've said, is at the end of the lesson. They've already had the verb to be. They've learned about expressions or chunks of language, nice to meet you, that sort of thing. They've done some intonation work. They've done some sentence stress. They're good to go. It's nice and easy to go. Let's move on to the next language skill, which is writing. Some of you will recognise, obviously, that this is the WhatsApp symbol, but a bit like the reading that I showed you with those business cards, and I think definitely, as I said, I often think reading is a chunk of text, and that's not really the case. In a similar way, writing can be one word. It can be one sentence. It's absolutely fine to have one sentence, and that's a writing activity. And certainly if you've got a non-Roman script, different writing system, this in itself will be a challenge anyway. So what you could do here, you could start up a WhatsApp group for your class, or a wiki page, or a group email, and simply ask students to send those greetings that we just saw in the speaking activity. How are you? I'm fine, thanks. It sounds really simple, and it might sound a little bit silly, but it is writing. It's a correct grammatical sentence. It conveys a message. It's got correct spelling, hopefully, correct word order, hopefully, correct punctuation, hopefully, and it's real life. It's meaningful. So do try to include these real life usages. And when they're ready to move beyond a single sentence and look at a set of sentences, they could look at a writing activity like this. So if you can see, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that, but that's Meg's review of a cafe. And there's only 6 sentences, I think, in this. So it's a very typical review. It's something you would see on social media, just a very short 5-6 sentences comment on an establishment. It's a model for students to follow, and it's not perfect. It's got 5 errors in it. We don't need to do this task. You can if you want. So the errors are highlighted there because we don't want to waste student time, class time with students. We just want to get on. Here are the errors. Match them with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 errors in B. It's a great writing activity there, just to highlight that there are common errors that might come up. This is what they might be. Find them and then correct them. It just raises a little bit of awareness before students then continue to, let's move to the next slide, to prepare their own chunk of reading. And I've included activity C there before activity D. We've got writing your post as the very final activity, but C is all about preparing for it. I think this is great for all levels, but particularly lower levels, that it's broken down into those stages. You're not just set off to write 6 sentences of a review of a place. Think about what content is going to go in there. You can write your little sentences there, describing what the people are like, food and drinks. Just break it down into something that's very simple and structured, and then students can do their writing. So we have gone through all the 4 language skills. Let's now move on to the language systems, the first one of which is vocab. So you'll remember this slide from earlier when we spoke about achievability and the number of lexical items. And I'd like to ask you a question here. And the question in blue at the top, how can you maximize this exercise? We've seen it before, 12 items of food, matching the words to the pictures. What else can you do with the vocab? What's your next activity? With realia, your favorite one, countables, creating a menu, crosswords, plural. These are fantastic answers. Back again. So your favourite one? Small chat on food. Yeah, likes, dislikes. Lovely. These are great. And the fantastic thing is all of these are really natural. It's the language that's prompting you to make these suggestions. So they're really natural, correct, real life usages. Brilliant. Brilliant. The healthiest. Healthy and unhealthy. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, these are great. Well, all of those are great. Those are brilliant ways to do a bit more with the exercise. You could also, I'll just give you a couple of my ideas. For Lexis, you could pull out even more. If we look in detail at those photos, there's a glass there, there's a cup, there's a saucer, a bowl, tomato, bread, jug, spoon, napkin, cutlery, fork. There's a bunch of other words that you can pull out there. We've had quite a few suggestions about I like, don't like. I think we've had some, any, countability. That would be great grammar. I notice no one's mentioned any pronunciation here. So you could have for that word stress, picking up on similar vowel sounds, hidden vowels. We've got vegetable there. Or have we got vegetable or vegetable? There's some pronunciation work. You can have functional language. Go to a shop, buy some food. Can I have some fish? Have you got any eggs? You can do write to your shopping list. You can swap the shopping list and read somebody else's, find a recipe online. What else can we have? You can record yourself, send it to a student. They can listen and tick the words that you mentioned. Lots to do there with Lexis. Let's move on to grammar. Our next place to visit for the language systems. So this is from Speak Your Mind Again. And it's a super simple activity, or is it? Let's see. So activity A, look at the sentences below. The verb to be is underlined. Circle the negative sentence. So I've included this one, and this, if we remember back to achievability, this is totally achievable. It's hopefully achievable that students have got an easy to understand task. We know to be is underlined. So one of those is negative, one of those is positive. There's a number of sort of simple structures in there. And it does look easy, but I would suggest it's maybe not. It may be, we've all actually got in here, if you look closely, we've got contractions, we've got the apostrophe, we've got subject, verb, object, word order. We've got capital letters for the first letter of the first word of a sentence. We've got capital letters for the first letter of a name. We've got a full stop at the end of the sentence. So for students lacking literacy or with the non-Roman script, there's going to be quite a lot going on there already. So don't rush through your material with the lower levels. Pace this lesson and remember the techniques we spoke about earlier. Sometimes when I've observed lessons, I'm quite surprised at how quickly teachers have got through their book and their lower levels. But actually, even just this tiny activity here, there's a lot going on in there. Don't rush it. Let's move on to our next language system, and that's pronunciation. So here's an example here. And we've got word stress on American, Mexican, Japanese, Spanish, and Chinese. So what activities could you do in addition to the listen and underline the stressed syllable? What do you think? Countries, yeah, absolutely. Country, nationality. Languages, spelling, request, use a board game, add a noun. Yes, super. Lovely ideas. These are fantastic. Thank you very much. These are great. Okay. What I'd quickly suggest with this is, I love all of those extension ideas. They're great. I think you can add even more to the information we've got here. So throw in more nationalities, more languages. So you could have Brazilian, Canadian, German, British. Add a new stress pattern, Greek, French, one syllable. You can, what else could you do? Pick up on the letters of the alphabet and the vowel sounds again. You could look at the phoneme and the grapheme relationship and start to build a little bit of awareness of sounds and spelling patterns. I'm just reading some words. Yep, capitals again. Yep, lovely. And also, I don't think anyone has mentioned drilling. I apologize if I've missed that. But also with this activity, we've asked students to listen to the words. We've asked them to underline the stressed syllable. So they've done the receptive work. So don't forget, we want them to be talking as well, to get that student talking time up. So drill those words. I know it can sound a bit boring, but it's absolutely essential. So drill. You can get them to whisper the words. They can shout the words. You can do it individually. You can do it with the whole class. You can do it holding your nose. Whatever way you do it. Have some fun with it and just encourage them to have a go. And let's move on to our final language system slide, which is functional language now. So just to quickly point out that this is one dialogue in 2 columns. It's not 2 separate dialogues. And again, if we were in a normal sort of workshop environment, I would give you this dialogue and ask you to build a lesson from it and suggest what you'd like to do with it. As that's not quite so easy today, obviously, as we're online, I just want to have this here to point out that we can pull out quite a few bits of language from here. If we look, the activities we can pull out here, we can pull out the waiter's language. If you can see the target language in bold there, I hope that's visible for you. So the waiter will say, what can I get you? What size? Small, medium or large? Customer's language, can I get a black coffee please? Large please. We can pull out who says those language. We can rebuild the dialogue. Let me show you. It's a very polite dialogue that's where there's lots of pleases. If we go to the next dialogue, all that's happened here is that we've got some of the customer phrases blocked out. So from here, you could ask your students to fill in those gaps, to replace them with different answers. And they can do this thinking about achievability, thinking about syllabus and that change of pace. They can do this as a written exercise. If it's been a bit of a tiring lesson, if you need that change of pace, a bit of a heads down, they can do it as a written exercise. For spontaneity, to push them more with a higher level, A2, say student, they can do this just speaking, not referring to any notes. And remember the importance of repetition. You can do it again in a slightly different way, but keep repeating it and keep progressing. So, and that brings us to the end. I'm aware that we're at the end of our hour now. So let's just quickly review what we've gone through. So at the very beginning, we defined lower levels, having looked at absolute and true beginners and said that they were pre-A1, A1 and A2. We reflected on our experience as an L2 lower level learner, and there was quite a variety of responses, some really positive ones. We've considered some linguistic theory relevant to lower levels. As I say, so many brilliant language learner theories which are applicable, but I hope we've looked at the ones which I feel are most important for lower levels, as well as that recent study. We've shared our views about teaching lower levels. We've gone through tips and techniques for lower levels with that STARTER acronym, the S for syllabus, T, teacher talk time, A, achievability, R, repetition, T, total physical response, E, empathy, R, repetition again. And then we've looked at some classroom activities, what you can do across the 4 language skills and across the 4 language systems. And that is very nearly the end. I have one more question, if I may, to you. And that question is, how do you feel about teaching lower levels now? I asked you at the beginning of the webinar, so I'm hoping for some positive answers now, frankly. Less scared, good, motivated, good, inspired, confident, lovely, good. Yeah, do be excited. It's such a great level. It's such a great level. It's just, one person said about not winging it with lower levels. You've got to be prepared. It's a good teacher that teaches lower levels, and you're all clearly great teachers.